Hello and welcome to our history skills video on how to write a good introduction. Introductions are really important in your answer. They set up what you're going to write for the rest of it, and they just help the reader and therefore the marker to understand where you're going. So there are three things that we would say are really important to make your introduction as good as it can be. The first is a helpful thing probably for you as a writer, but also for the person reading, to fill them with confidence that you know what you're talking about. And that is just maybe a line or a sentence of context at the start of your answer. The second is that you outline briefly the points that you're going to make. If it's a change continuity question, a point about change and a point about continuity. If it's a cause question where there's factors involved, there may be a sentence about each of the 2 or 3 factors that you're going to discuss. And the third thing that makes your introduction a really good introduction is stating what your answer is going to be in the end. A lot of students feel uncomfortable with this because it's a bit of a change from GCSE and it feels like you're kind of revealing your answer before you ought to. But there are 2 things to bear in mind here. Firstly, that your answer is the whole essay. It's not an investigation where you're looking at both sides evenly and then coming to a conclusion in the end. It is an argument that you're trying to pitch from the start. So that's the first thing, just the nature of the essay. The second reason that we say it's really good to state your answer at the beginning is because the exam board puts stuff in their mark scheme about there being a sustained analysis all the way through and there being logic and coherence to your answer. And one easy way of showing that right at the start is by stating your answer so that it's easy for the examiner later on to say, yes, they sustained that analysis and that judgment right from the beginning where they outlined it. Let's have a look at some exemplars. So we're going to look through 3 examples of introductions from the 3 essays from the 3 different routes that we study at Peter Symonds. This first one is a Henry II essay. How accurate is it to say that the greatest threat to Henry II's control of the Angevin lands in the years 1180 to 89 was the ambition of Philip Augustus to extend his territory? So this is a cause question about what was that greatest threat to Henry's control. And in the answer here, you can see that the student has started the introduction with a bit of context. From 1180 until the year of Henry's death, he faced numerous threats from his own family, namely his 4 sons, and from Philip II of France. So they've not done a lot there to contextualize what's happening, but they have mentioned the sons, and they've highlighted that Philip Augustus was also called Philip II of France. So there's a little sense of I know what I'm talking about. They then introduce the first factor that they're going to talk about. It could be said that the main threat of Philip II's ambition was to destroy Henry II's power base in France due to his use of Angevin family jealousies against Henry. So it's just an outline of that factor that, yes, it is true to say that Philip's ambition was a problem for Henry. They then move on to introduce the second factor, the alternate factor. However, it could also be said that Henry's lack of diplomacy was the biggest threat to himself when concerning his sons. So this is introducing a second factor. Now, ideally, I'd like to see a third factor here as well, but they've just gone for 2 factors, and the student was writing under exam conditions and didn't have time perhaps for the third factor. But they do finish off the introduction by outlining their answer or stating their answer. Due to the way Henry II treated his sons and tried to aggravate Philip, the main threat to Henry II's control of his Angevin lands was his own stubbornness and lack of diplomacy. So there you can see just a line of context at the start, introduce the factor in the question, introduce an alternate factor, state what your answer is. You can see this again in this essay, short essay introduction on Germany from Route B. I throw this in to highlight actually that you don't need to write a long introduction. We're not talking about longer is better. We're talking about precise is better. So this question, to what extent did Bismarck succeed in reducing tensions in the new Germany, 1871-79? A change continuity question. The change obviously is succeed in reducing tensions. Continuity would be no, tensions remained. So again, just a line here of, in fact, quite a long line of context following the unification of Germany in 1871. So just highlighting that they know that's when the unification happens, not in the question. There it is, they know that. One of Bismarck's key aims was to unify the German people in order to overcome the many divisions which persisted as a result of a history of separate states. Now, you might have inferred that from the question, but again, you're just sort of highlighting that you know why this question is being asked there. And then introducing the answer to the change part of the question. In many ways, Bismarck achieved this through a combination of measures intended to create a sense of unity. And we would expect then in their paragraph about that creation of a sense of unity for the student to talk about what those measures were. And then they go on to both introduce their answer and the counterpoint together, although on balance, it is clear that this was largely superficial. So they're saying they don't think that change did really happen. It was largely superficial, and many tensions apparent before 1871 remained. So that's the other side, the continuity of those tensions that had been there before 1871. So again, in this situation, the student has outlined a little bit of context at the start, nothing like rocket science there, but just sort of showing that they know what they're talking about. Then they've introduced the idea of change, and then they've said, no, actually, I think on balance that the continuity was more important. And then finally, this is from Route C, an essay on the Cultural Revolution. How accurate is it to say that the main consequence of the Cultural Revolution was the destruction of traditional Chinese culture? So this clearly is a consequence question, and like all consequence questions, it's going to be a factor-based question. So the factor they're suggesting was the main consequence was the destruction of traditional Chinese culture. So again, the student here starts with a little bit of context. The Cultural Revolution was launched in May 1966, nice use of a date. It was initially an internal purge of the Communist Party, but it developed into a national mass campaign, just showing, again, just defining almost what the Cultural Revolution was. Both of those strategies are good for the context. A date to clarify when things happened, an idea of defining something to be precise about what it is you're talking about. Then they introduce the first consequence. The destruction of traditional Chinese culture was a major physical consequence of the revolution. So they're saying, yes, it was, and they're highlighting that's a physical consequence. However, next factor, the societal changes, which were often permanent, for example, the huge loss of life, should be considered the main consequence of the Cultural Revolution. So again, like the Route B essay, they're introducing their second factor here and their answer at the same time. So they're saying that this second factor is the societal changes, the changes for people's lives, and that this is the biggest factor. And then because it's a factor question and they thought they'd have time, they also introduce or outline a third factor too. It could also be argued that the resurgence of Mao and the growth of his personality cult was an equally significant factor, but it cannot be compared with either of the other two, as Mao's death in 1976 finishes that. So that's sort of saying that there is a third factor, but it's not quite as important as the other two. Now, so again, here we've got a little bit of context at the start and then an introduction of the three factors that they're going to talk about. And as they've gone through the factors, they've just made it clear what that rank order is going to be. The third one there is the weakest of the three. The middle one, the societal changes, is the most significant one. And the first one is acknowledged, but is not as significant. The order of those points that we make, the context, the outline, and the introduction, the stating of your answer, isn't quite as important, I would say, as getting them all done. But you've seen there in each case how the student has done it. So I hope that's helpful, and yeah, see you again.